guys, Emma here, and today I would like to read out some fan fiction that I wrote. What I wrote. It's more of an observation rather than a story, I think, but it takes place after season 3 and after the final dossier, and I just wanted to read it because someone mentioned fan fiction on one of my other videos. I do like to write. I've never actually written any fan fiction before, but sometimes, you know, I think often about Twin Peaks and where storylines might go once they have stopped, once they haven't been continued. Like, one of the things that really interested me to write about was Annie, because her story, well, she was conspicuously I can't speak, you idiot, you stupid. One of the stories that really interested me was Annie, because she was like conspicuously absent in season 3, but then we had more of her story in the final dossier, and it was a really sad story, and it kind of touched me in a way. I felt compelled to kind of go into her story in my imagination and to think what her life had been like, basically, because her story was really sad. So before I read the fan fiction, it's just a short piece, I want to do a shout out. Cameron from Obnoxious and Anonymous, you probably know his channel if you're a Twin Peaks fan. He is trying to get a Twin Peaks fan film made. He's very passionate about it, and if you watch his channel you know that he likes to talk about Twin Peaks, and he is very knowledgeable about Twin Peaks, and he also has a deep passion for Annie, the character of Annie. So I think that his story revolves around Annie, Dale, Wyndham and Caroline. He is trying to raise $25,000 for the film. He is doing a campaign for that, so you can donate if you have any spare cash and you want to see this fan film made. If you're a Twin Peaks fan, I think it's something that you probably will be interested in. There are various perks that you can get if you donate a certain amount of money, and I said that I would happily be part of a video cast or podcast or whatever you want to call it. If you have deep pockets, if you have some serious dough, man, some serious dough, then you can donate $1,000 and you can choose to be on a live stream with either me or Hal. Got a like. So yeah, you can engage with me or Hal and Cameron if you bid that amount, and if you can't afford $1,000, you can donate like any amount you want, I think, and he's about on $6,000 at the moment, so he needs a big boost to get to his target. So yeah, go and do that, and perhaps we'll be chatting someday soon. Okay, so on to my fan fiction. I just want to say that my fan fiction is not affiliated with like Cameron's movie at all. It just happens to be about Annie. I want to apologise because when I read, my Geordie accent comes out a little bit more. That might sound like Japanese to some of you, but it actually means throw your hammer over here, sir, in Geordie. So if you need an audio key, that's it. Okay, like I said, this is a short piece and I've called it I Have Some News. Norma woke up, and for the first time in a long time the other side of her big bed felt warm and it smelled familiar. A faint dawn light was cascading through the window, chasing the shadows of the night from the corners of the room. Ed? Norma's voice was sweet and soft, like musical church bells that carry on the wind. I'm right here, sweetheart. The reply was quick and confident. What are you doing? Norma squirmed in the bed, caressing the sheets where her lover had just been lying moments before. Well, I was going to sneak off and make you some breakfast, the tall man chuckled as he stooped over to tie up his shoelaces. But I guess I've been caught. The two of them laughed in unison, and it was a beautiful sound, a song that had been lost for decades but which was now at full volume again. Within the half-lit room a strange and powerful energy surged, and the two lovers gazed at each other as though there was nothing else in the whole wide universe to ever see. The spell was broken when Norma suddenly seemed to remember something. When it came to knowing Norma, Ed's intuition was acute. "What is it, sweetheart?" he said. Norma straightened up suddenly, and the corners of her mouth dropped, making her look much older than she had seemed just a second ago. Her hand gripped the edge of the bedsheet and turned it over and over again into little tight knots. "I have to go and see Annie today," Norma said sadly, and then nodded, as if a terrible question had been asked and answered. "I'll take you," Ed said with finality. "Oh no, Ed." The interjection was swift and there was almost a hint of panic in Norma's voice. "I couldn't ask you to do that." "Hey, I want to," Ed protested. Norma seemed about to say more, but then she stopped, swallowed and nodded again. Her shoulders dropped a little and she took a deep, steadying breath. She'd done this so many times, she told herself. It was going to be all right. Grace Stillman checked her reflection in the window of the ward kitchen. It was the last thing she did before she officially started her shift. "I look good," she told herself. "I look normal." Since she started work at the facility a few months ago, she had found herself looking at her own reflection more often than usual. She wanted to make sure that she was the same old Grace, that nothing had changed without her knowing so. It had occurred to Grace more than a few times that there seemed to be a very fine line between being absolutely fine and being absolutely not fine at all. The people that Grace helped to look after at the facility had all sorts of backgrounds, and Grace couldn't help but think that perhaps what had happened to them could easily happen to her one day too. This had been just one of the many challenging issues she'd found herself having to deal with since starting her new job. She often found herself thinking about her friends and family and how they had evaluated her character. "You must have a heart of gold," her aunt had said. "It's a tough job, but you're perfect for it," her mother had commented. Grace wanted to live up to those mighty expectations, but she was struggling to attain the sense of being an all-giving, all-loving saint figure. She was terribly disappointed in herself that whenever she was around a patient, she would simply have the urge to stare and gawk at the spectacle that was before her. It was simply so terrifying to see some of these people lost in the maze of their own minds. They had lost control, and they had lost themselves. First job of the day consisted of feeding breakfast to one of the long-term patients. Her name was Annie Blackburn, and out of all the patients in the care facility, she was the one who Grace found most fascinating. Grace had originally thought that Annie was a much younger woman because her face was smooth like ivory soap, and there was no markers of time etched into that pale, tender skin. When Grace discovered that Annie was actually old enough to be her mother, she was mystified. Grace had never heard Annie speak. Some of the nurses had told Grace that Annie only spoke once a year, and that she always said the same thing. Grace didn't know whether to believe this, or to file it away as an urban myth, or perhaps as a joke that was played on the new girl. She was inclined to believe it was some kind of sick joke, after the nurses explained to her that Annie always said, "I'm fine," and after telling her they collapsed into fits of giggles and aped those words with grim and twisted accents. Grace entered the room softly and as slowly as possible, almost as if she expected a monster to be on the other side of the door. There wasn't a monster there, though. There was Annie. She was sitting in a chair by the window and the sunlight was cascading through her long golden hair. She looked like an angel at rest. Grace approached and set out all of her utensils one by one without acknowledging Annie at all. Annie stared forwards without any expression, but her eyes were always alert and still, seemingly watching something of great importance, but something that was not of this world. Finally, Grace stopped, preparing for breakfast, and looked into those strange deep eyes of Annie Blackburn. "It's time for breakfast, Annie," Grace said with as much enthusiasm as she could muster. Norma lowered the car window as Ed urged the truck along the long, cool road. Tall pines leaned into the asphalt stream, darkening the sky and creating a bumpy cast on the edge of the sun. A sharp, clean aroma flowed from the woods to the waking world. Norma breathed it in, slowly and as deeply as she could. She needed to steady her nerves. Ed could sense the tension in her body, and his eyes darted nervously from the road to his lover, wondering what to do. "I bet Annie can't wait to see you," Ed attempted to diffuse the fear. Norma's lips twitched and she closed her eyes for a moment. She nodded. "That's what I have to tell myself," she laughed softly. She was laughing at the universe, at how cruel it could be. "If you can't face it today, Norma, I'm sure she'd understand," Ed said. "No, Ed, that's not it. It's..." Norma appeared unable to continue for a moment. "It's the happiest time of my life. Us, our love, Ed, everything is absolutely perfect, but Annie..." Norma paused and looked out onto the blurry horizon. "Annie's never had anything," Norma said sadly. "She's been sitting in that chair for 25 years. She's never felt the rain on her skin on a cold winter's day. She's never laughed with a girlfriend over coffee and cake. She hasn't stopped to hear birdsong on her way to work. She hasn't walked down the aisle or known what it's like to be a mother. Norma's voice was tighter and more fraught the more she said. She's never even had a man give her flowers, or even a compliment. She's been made of stone for 25 years. What did she do to deserve that, Ed? Why did this happen to my sister? She threw her hands up to the sky, as if she was addressing some all-knowing but unyielding deity. Ed shook his head and reached out his hand, rubbing it on Norma's shoulder. There was no answer. There was no comfort. Grace wiped some whispers of food from the tender lips of Annie Blackburn. It was surprising how cooperative Annie was taking her meal. Feeding Annie was not the hard part of the job. It was trying to make conversation with a woman who was there in body, but who wasn't there in mind or soul. Or was she? It was impossible to tell, and that unnerved Grace. Today, like most other days, Grace was trying to make small talk about the weather. It wasn't working, though. Grace felt strangely under pressure to be real today, to try and connect with Annie. The feeling that she must talk to Annie, to really talk, became stronger and stronger until she had to stop and steady herself. She glanced towards the door as if to check that she wouldn't be overheard by any of the nurses. "You know," Grace said shyly, "my mom passed when I was a little girl. For some reason I think of her when I'm around you." She smiled up at Annie, but there was no response. Suddenly, though, Grace had the strangest daydream. She was a little baby, laughing and gurgling in Annie's arms, and Annie was gazing down at her as though she loved her most in the world. Annie's skin was rosy and warm, her eyes sparkling. She was a different creature to the real-life Annie. Grace snapped out of the daydream quickly, but the feeling of being loved didn't die away with the imagery of her dream. She reached out and touched Annie's hand, and the feeling of Annie's ice-cold skin was electrifying, making Grace pull her hand back in fright. Norma and Ed pulled up, and Ed stopped the engine. There was an unearthly silence hanging over the couple. Norma straightened her clothing as if her cleanliness was about to be inspected by an official. "Okay," she said decisively, but as she looked towards the white brick wall of the care facility, a shiver went down her spine. The building looked like a nowhere place, somewhere between worlds that was home to nobody and nothing, and Annie was stuck there. Ed's eyes had wandered across the room where he could see a small gift shop selling flowers and love tokens. His fingers twitched as though they were playing an invisible piano as he thought about what he could possibly give to Annie. "Honey, you go ahead," he said after formulating a secret idea. "I'll be right in." "Okay, darling," Norma said with a syrupy tone. "Don't be long." "I won't," Ed laughed. As Norma reached Annie's room, the door opened and a young woman exited. The girl was only in her early 20s and she looked too young to be dealing with people who had such serious mental health issues. The girl's face was blue-toned like cold wet clay, and her eyes were flickering around as though she'd been startled. Norma called out to her, "Are you okay, sweetheart?" The girl looked up in a frantic pulse of movement. Her breath was caught in her mouth like a frenetic breeze captured in the branches of a cold winter tree. She could only shake her head in a strange dumb show. "I'm Norma. Who are you, sweetheart?" Norma extended her hand, but instead of waiting for the girl to offer her own hand, she instead caressed the shoulder of the girl, soothing her and bringing her back to reality. "I'm Grace," the girl said. "I was just... Wait, Norma? Are you here to see Annie Blackburn?" Norma nodded. "I am. She's my sister." "Of course." Grace appeared to be colouring up, her body and soul reanimated. "You look so much alike." Norma smiled at that idea. Grace pulled away suddenly. "I have to go now," she said with a taut, dark voice. "Enjoy your visit." Grace rushed off, and Norma watched her disappear down the dimly lit corridor. It was funny, Norma thought. That girl seemed so familiar to her. It was like she'd known her in another life. Ed walked into the gift store like a man on a mission. He was a tall man, and he stooped as he passed through the door, not because the frame was really too low, but more out of a kind of habit. He was a man who possessed an impressive youthfulness and energy given his actual age, and as he walked he seemed to bounce and buzz like an insect skimming over a pond. Now that Norma was in his life again, that energy source felt more potent than ever, and it came from a fountain that was overflowing. He felt like a brand new car whose engine was being turned over by the hottest gal in town. There were a few other customers in the store. They were waiting in line and being served by what appeared to be the most disinterested salesperson you could ever see. The bald man was sitting down, half reading a book and half mumbling to his customers. Ed waited in line, and as he did so, he glanced over to see what the book was that the salesperson was so interested in devouring. Ed couldn't read the whole title, but he could see, in bold gold typeface, what appeared to say, "The Book of." There were some strange symbols on the front and along the spine of the book too. Ed was skilled enough to know that these appeared to be occult symbols, and he took another look at the face of the man reading, evaluating whether this man could be a real danger or someone who was simply a dabbler into the dark arts. Ed decided on the latter and moved up the queue as another customer was duly dispatched. As it became Ed's turn to be served, the salesperson suddenly snapped the book shut and slammed it down on the counter. He bounded up like a jack-in-the-box and pointed a stiff, pudgy finger at Ed. "And you, sir, let me guess, you're looking for a gift for a lady." His mannerisms were so theatrical and absurd, and Ed was astounded by the sudden change in his demeanour. "Good guess," Ed faltered, looking around to make sure he wasn't the only customer left in the store. Thankfully, there was a couple of other people lingering by a store display. The salesman spun round, turning his back towards Ed. His movement was like that of a ballroom dancer, although it looked slightly ridiculous and incongruous given the man's short stature and obesity. Behind the counter there was a huge display of different flowers, dressed as bouquets or set in baskets. The salesman's hand hovered over each of the flower heads. "No, no, no," he said, dismissing one bloom after another. "This one is too much. That one is not the right one for you, sir." Ed was bemused by the sales pitch. He'd never seen anything quite like it. "Aha! Here it is, sir." A booming cry filled the store, and the two other customers jumped out of their skins and looked over at Ed, who shuffled and cleared his throat with embarrassment. The salesman plucked at a flower and spun around to present it to Ed. It was a single red rose. Ed looked at it with confusion. "One rose?" he queried. "Is that enough?" The salesman looked baffled by this question, and he leaned in towards Ed as if he was going to share the most startling secret in the universe. "Why, sir," he whispered, "it's everything." Norma settled herself in the chair beside Annie, then leaned over and took hold of both of her hands. They felt damp and cold, and the nails were too long. Norma rubbed at the skin with her fingers, hoping to infuse them with life. "I'm so happy to see you, Annie," Norma said, but she couldn't make eye contact with her sister. "I have some news for you." Annie remained unresponsive. She was, Norma suddenly thought, like the picture of the Queen of Hearts in a deck of cards. Her mouth was set in that strange half-smile, and her body was still and erect, hidden in folds of clothes that were too big for her, but she looked beautiful and important. "Ed and I are finally... well, we're finally free, Annie." Norma burst into a spontaneous laugh, as though she couldn't quite believe what she was saying. "We're going to be married, and Nadine, well, I know what you're thinking, but Nadine, she let Ed go because she has this thing for Dr. Jacoby. Remember him? I know you do, sweetheart. And it means that Ed and I..." She inhaled, barely able to contain herself. "Oh, we're just so happy, Annie." She finally steadied herself and looked at Annie square in the eyes. "We're just so happy," she repeated, sadly. As Norma gazed up at Annie's unlined face, she couldn't help but think about the markers of time and what they meant. She thought about the moments and events in her life that anchored time, and which had created her own history. Annie had no markers, no anchors. Without them, where was she and who was she? Was she adrift on an endless brutal sea, a soul that was young and yet fossilized? Just then the door opened and Ed walked in softly. He looked a little shy, a little uncertain. Norma saw the rose in his hand and she beamed at him, restoring his confidence. He stood up, tall and proud. "Hello, Annie," Ed said as he approached the woman. "I brought you something." He bent down and picked up one of Annie's limp hands, wrapping it around the gnarly stem of the red rose. "There you go, sweetheart," he said with a happy drawl. "A beautiful rose for a beautiful lady." He looked briefly at Annie's serene face, wondering if she had any idea of what was going on. It seemed like there was a world of starlight and space stretching for miles and miles behind those fixed and glassy eyes. Grace had returned to her duties and was circling back around the unit when she saw Ed and Norma leaving Annie's room. She made an instant decision to hover in the corridor behind them so that she wouldn't have to talk to either of them. It was always too hard to look at the faces of the family and friends of a patient just after a visit. Grace returned to Annie's room, and as she entered she thought how strange it was that there seemed to be a different vibe in the room now. It was as though all of the atoms in the dead air had been charged up and were silently vibrating. Annie appeared to have turned her head just slightly to the window, and her upper body seemed more relaxed than it had been before. Grace smiled and deduced that Norma's visit had really made a difference for Annie, even though this difference was probably something the rest of the world wouldn't have noticed. Grace could see it and feel it. "Oh, how lovely!" Grace exclaimed then, looking down at the rose entwined in Annie's hands. Annie had somehow moved one of her hands up around the head of the rose, so that a few of the petals had been crushed and they were now strewn in her lap. Grace knelt and straightened Annie's fingers one by one until the head of the rose was free. She then picked up the flower and smelled it. "I'll put this in water," Grace said. "It's a beautiful rose for a beautiful lady. A beautiful blue rose." So yeah, kind of a short story, kind of just an observation, a literary organising of my own imagination, I guess. But I hope you enjoyed it, and as I said, if you like Annie and you want to see more of Annie, then think about donating to Cameron's film fund, because he wants to get that film made, and I think it would be really exciting for the Twin Peaks fan community. So I'm going to try and watch Lost Highway sometime this week. And I want to also say that I'm starting to watch this series on Netflix. It's called Dark, and it's a German show. And it was advertised in my TV guide, and this is what it said. "This series certainly lives up to its name. It's set in Winden, Germany, where nothing ever happens, or at least it hasn't since Copper Ulrich's brother disappeared 33 years ago. At about the same time, a nuclear power plant opened the... coincidence? It's now 2019 and a dad, Michael, hangs himself, then that's not funny, hangs himself, then returns to his son Jonas in creepy visions. Then a teenage boy disappears, and we soon discover he's being held hostage in a bedroom, being tortured with that's not funny either, stop laughing. He's being held hostage and tortured with electricity and 80s music." That is quite funny. "Meanwhile, there are strange noises coming from nearby caves, and an old man wanders the streets warning, 'It's happening again.'" So when I read that, I thought, you know, that sounds like a familiar tagline, and it sounds like something dark that I would like. So I'm going to watch the first episode, see if it's any good, and probably do a review of the first episode if anybody's interested in that. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook at The Vlog Lady. If you want to leave a comment below, you can. I want to apologise for the light. It's actually snowing outside, so it's actually daylight, but it's like just dark. Anyway, see you soon, hopefully. Bye.